Hello, welcome to the Scripture and Ministry Seminars, the interview series. I'm Peter Cha. I'm a teaching faculty member in the Pastoral Theology Department at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and today we're joined by Pastor Charlie Dates, one of our alums from MDiv program, who is now an associate pastor of a very vibrant church in the south side of Chicago. And we also have a special guest speaker with us today, Dr. George Yancey from Dallas. He's currently serving as an associate professor of sociology at University of North Texas, and focusing on primarily the areas of race and ethnicity and biracial families. But also, he has also been a founder of Reconciliation Consulting, a ministry that is seeking to help out local churches that are primarily interested in developing multiracial congregations. And he has also been a very prolific author. He had produced a number of books that is seeking to help pastors and lay leaders with this project of becoming multiracial congregations. And we have several books that he had written recently back here, One Body, One Spirit, as well as a more recent book, Beyond Racial Gridlock, and both are done by InterVarsity Press. And he's also co-author of a book called United by Faith, published by Oxford University Press. And Just Don't Marry One is another title of another book. And today, Dr. Yancey is on our campus to participate in a couple of engagements, and particularly making a presentation to a group of pastors and theologians in the area of developing multiracial congregations. So, Dr. Yancey, welcome to our campus, and Pastor Charlie, welcome back to our campus. So we would like to start our conversation by raising this one question, and that is particularly to work on this book, or this book comes from a project that you and your colleagues have been engaged in studying of various multiracial congregations in the United States. And I just want to ask you, what drew you personally and as a sociologist to studying of this phenomenon, and what are some larger insights or lessons that you have gained from this particular project of research?
Yeah, well, part of it was my research on multiracial families that really got me interested in multiracial churches, because one of the things I noted was how multiracial families, they desire to have a racially diverse atmosphere to worship in. And so eventually I wanted to work in multiracial churches, and I was looking for opportunities to do so. And I was contacted by Michael Emerson about this grant project, and kind of funny. I was working on trying to obtain a $20,000 grant to do a pilot study, and he was working on a $500,000 grant. So, sometimes God's will is very obvious.
Right.
And it was quite obvious in that case which one I should really put my time and effort into. And so that got me into the Lilly study, which allowed me then to work with Michael and with Karen Chai, and to do the research. Like you said, it was the first national study on multiracial congregations, and hopefully it's pioneering some other work in this area. You asked me also what I learned, and I learned there's a lot of wonderful people out there doing very hard work, that it's very tough to do this sort of work. I think it's very necessary work, but it's very tough work. There are some amazing ministries out there, some vibrant ministries, and it's vibrant because it brings in these different cultures. People are learning, and there's pain that's overcome, and there's victories to rejoice about. So there's some wonderful ministries out there. There's some people who are not doing too well, that are struggling trying to do this as well. So I don't want to paint an overly glowy picture.
Right.
But there's some wonderful stuff out there, and it really helps to see people doing things that sort of transcend their own culture, their own well, it seems like their own abilities, but what only God can do. So in that sense, beyond all the findings, that was inspiring as well.
Right.
I met some wonderful people doing this.
Wonderful. Now, in your book, you pointed out that roughly about 8% of the congregations in the United States are striving to be, or are indeed, multiracial congregations. And if you could explain to us, how do you define what multiracial congregation is? And when you say 8%, what sort of a number are we looking at? 100, 1,000?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, we define a multiracial congregation as a congregation where no one racial group makes up more than 80% of the worship service. we excluded congregations that had missions points at the church. We did not just add all those people together, because sometimes congregations will have like maybe missions to Latinos, Latinas, or missions to Asian groups.
Right.
Because we want people to intermix for it to really matter. And so that's how we define multiracial congregations. As far as I'm sorry, your second point was what the number means.
Yeah.
Oh, well, think about it this way: that 8% is all congregations everywhere. If you Catholic congregations actually are more likely to be multiracial, so they're about 12%. So we're looking at Protestants. We're really looking at 5% for evangelicals, and for mainliners, probably about 2.5% of all congregations are multiracial. And so, as you might well imagine, what we're saying is, among Protestants, out of every 20 churches, only one of them is going to be multiracial. And then we're looking at mainline churches. Out of every 40 churches, only one of them is going to be multiracial. So you can see where we're coming from as far as the scarcity, the relative scarcity of these churches.
Thank you. Now, one of the things that I'm sure you have encountered, and you briefly touched on in your book, is that many of the pastors, when they hear about something like a multiracial ministry, they raise two primary concerns. One is, sort of conventional wisdom about church growth principle is that when you target one specific group, there is more likelihood that church would grow more rapidly, evangelism done more vigorously. And so it's an issue of, the missional element of the church. We are called to evangelize. Now, are we to do this multiracial ministry at the expense of evangelism, as if there is a either-or, choice that you have to make? And then the other side is what I'm hearing more from racial minority congregations who are concerned that, because we have this monoracial church, we are able to preserve our own sense of cultural heritage better. And secondly, facilitate a healthier process of identity formation for particularly our young kids who are growing up in a racialized society. Now, going multiracial, doesn't that in any way negatively impact what we're hoping to do for our younger generations? What have you found in your research? Are those two concerns very empirically valid, or you have some other a phenomenon that seem to counter those two concerns?
Those concerns on the face of it are very, very real, and it's very easy to understand how people would have that sort of concern, Peter. Let me just take it one at a time, the whole church growth thing. When that came out, the evidence they were using, they were looking at a lot of missions. They were looking at a lot of what we call case studies. And so based on that and based on that time of our country, it made sense to perhaps go for just one racial group. I don't think it no longer makes that much sense. I've actually done some research that shows that churches that are multiracial are more likely to grow than churches that are not multiracial. And I think, and the difference wasn't stark, but it was there. But I think that difference is going to grow over time, because over time, more and more people are developing friends of different races. I have a friend who's white, and my church is all black. I don't feel comfortable inviting my friend to my church. So I think that more over time, we're going to see that the growing churches are going to be more likely to be multiracial churches. I even question whether or not in 30 and 40 years, whether or not churches can be relevant and still be predominantly of one racial group. I mean, we'll still have them, but will they be relevant in a society where everyone now is starting to interact? We see the increase in interracial relationships, marriages, interracial friendships, all that's growing. And so I would say that really to do church growth, we're going to have a new model. And that model is how we're going to be able to incorporate different groups and bring them in and learn the lessons that some of these vibrant ministries are teaching us. And so that's what the empirical work tells us. Now, the other concern is very interesting, because as an African American, I know about having a black identity. And I know that identity is very important to me. And I know what the black church means. So let me just go ahead and say this. I've never argued that all churches have to be multiracial. That's never been my argument. My argument has been that in a country as diverse as ours, it should be higher than 8%. Now, what that percent should be at this point, I'm not going to give you a number.
Right.
I think 8 is too low.
Right.
100 is probably too high.
Right.
So somewhere in the middle, that's where we need to be. Having said that, that means that there is a need for some churches, African American churches, immigrant churches. There needs to be some churches that minister to a minority population. I acknowledge that. But here's the interesting thing, and I'm not so sure this is true for African Americans, but as far as immigrant populations, there's been some interesting research that's just been done, not by me, but by another professor. Her name escapes me at the moment. And what she looked at was Korean American congregations. And she looked at 2 congregations, second-generation Korean American congregations. One was multiracial, one was primarily Korean American. And what she found was the Korean Americans in the multiracial congregation, their Korean identity actually was in some ways stronger than the ones that was in the Korean church. The ones in the Korean church, they were concentrating more on how to assimilate into the general culture. The ones in the multiracial congregation, because they were with other people, there was a contrast, and they felt more free to really express their Korean American identity. It's almost like salt can bring out flavor in things. And, this is just one study. But if it is an accurate reflection of what's happening, in many ways, being a multiracial congregation helps us to feel even more ethnic, not less. Now, this may be different for African Americans. There's a different history there,
Sure.
and we should be very careful about that.
Sure.
But I think the assumption that multiracial churches sort of smother ethnic identity has to be challenged. And I think that we'd be very careful about just making that assumption and saying we shouldn't have multiracial churches because people of color are going to lose their identity.
In some ways, I think it was one of the, I think it was a German poet who once said something like, you really don't know your own language unless you know another one.
Yeah.
Right? So being in that more multiracial setting,
Right.
one becomes more conscientious of a certain heritage you received that may not have been as highlighted in your own setting, but you go to a more multi-ethnic setting and you begin to see now there are certain things about you that is very unique as you see others and begin to cherish that more.
Oh, yeah, I agree. And you also learn what you have in common as well as what's distinct, but you also begin to appreciate those distinctiveness.
Yes.
And you also come to understand that it's okay to have them. It's not, that it's all right to have those distinctions because they don't kill our fellowship with the people who come from different cultures.
Great.
First, let me say thank you to Dr. Cha, the Henry Center, and those who invited me. And my pleasure, Dr. Yancey, to be sitting with you today. I serve as Pastor Peter. Dr. Cha mentioned as one of the associate pastors at a predominantly African American church in Chicago. It's actually the largest African American church in Chicago. And I was recently afforded the opportunity to have dinner with Michael Limerson. Actually, it was last year. And it was a group from our church and a group from the largest Anglo church, if you will, in the Chicagoland area. We had come together to...
Was it Willow Creek?
It was Willow Creek with Dr. John Perkins to explore some issues. And Dr. Emerson said to me how great it would be if your church and Willow came together to plant a church. And so my mind started swirling, as it is now, about how we can make that happen, what would prevent that from happening. One of the very obvious things is that our church is situated in one of the poorest districts in Illinois, more specifically the Chicagoland area. And Willow Creek is in one of the more affluent communities in the state of Illinois. What impact from your research have you found that socioeconomics and the disparities between socioeconomics, what impact does that have either positively or negatively in forming multiracial churches? And then once multiracial churches come together, if they're able to do that across the economic lines, what kind of impact do you think that could have on economics in society as a whole?
That's great questions because I I actually have an article coming out that addresses some of what you just asked. And what my article documents is that multiracial churches are more likely than other churches to have a variety of different economic classes. In other words, being multiracial, it's also multi-class. So first off, a multiracial congregation, and you think about it, it makes sense because different racial groups tend to be in certain classes. I mean, certain racial groups tend to be or more likely to be underclass and things of this nature. So you bring people together, then you're more likely to get people from the underclass and from the wealthy class all going to church together. So that is something that definitely does happen. Now, another interesting thing about it, you mentioned about how would this change our economic situation. One of the things that I found out is that when you have this sort of interracial contact, not just in church settings, but also in multiracial families, that African Americans and Latino Americans, the ones who wind up in these multiracial churches, on average, are better off economically and educationally than other African Americans and Latino Americans. Now, that leaves a question, obvious question. That is it that a multiracial church attracts the wealthier African Americans, Latino Americans, or do they come to a multiracial church and somehow that helps them to become more successful? And really the answer is both. That there's evidence that it does attract those who are wealthier and better educated, but there's also evidence that it may enable them to be more successful. How? In our society,